any direct questions that anyone has that you want me to address before I get into my notes? All right. So this is the book, The Souls of Black Folks, a seminal text in just the literary canon, especially in the Black radical tradition, in the Black literary tradition. What I'm going to do, though, and I need to actually include this into the PDF that's on the site. I'm going to read to you guys the opening paragraph of the foreword, what he calls the forethought of the book. And I think he offers some gems in the forethought on how to engage the work. Again, this probably would have been beneficial for you guys prior to reading it, but I do want you guys to have access to this information. So he says, herein lie buried many things which if read with patience may show the strange meaning of being black here in the dawning of the 20th century. This meaning is not without interest to you, gentle reader, for the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. I pray you, then, receive my little book in all charity, studying my words with me, forgiving a mistake and foible for the sake of the faith and passion that is in me, and seeking the grain of truth hidden there. So this is how he opens up the forethought of the text. A couple of things I want to kind of point out to you guys. So one, he says, herein lie buried, right? So these meetings are going to be deep within the pages of these texts, right? And he says, which if read with patience, right, may show the strange meaning of being black. So to me, what's important there is the patience. There's a slowness that you would have to kind of engage this text with to get what he's getting at. Um, Even the cadence of the reading is very slow if read out loud, right? And then he asks, I pray. So this is that grace that he's requesting. So read my book with a little bit of grace, I pray, right? Um, you receive my book in all charity, right? Studying my words with me. So he's taking you on a journey along with him, right? And then forgive my mistakes. Again, that's this charity that this is that grace that he's asking for, right? And then seeking the grain. So, if you think about a grain of sand, right? A grain of salt, a grain of rice, it's small. The grain of truth hidden there, right? So you're going to have to kind of dig deep to uncover these truths. You're going to have to engage it with patience. You're going to have to engage this text with grace, right? So these are the things that he felt was important that he wants to give you guys some thought about before you engage the text. A little bit about W.E.B. Du Bois himself. Um, Probably one of the most phenomenal thinkers, I mean, in our history, right? And I think I mentioned this last week. There would be no American sociology without W.E.B. Du Bois. He was trained in Howard. Sorry, well, actually, no, excuse me. He went to Harvard, got his degree in Harvard. He came in with a master's degree. They told him to go back and get another master's degree before he was able to get his Ph.D. In doing so, he went to, I believe, the Frankfurt School in Germany. I don't know how many of you are into history, especially sociology, but if you are, you know how instrumental the Frankfurt School was in just modern thought of the time, right? All the great thinkers were attending the Frankfurt School. Your Marx, your Durkheim, all these sociologists were contemporaries of Du Bois. Um, they say the first sociological text that was produced in America was the Philadelphia Negro, a text published by W.E.B. Du Bois, right? So he is really a juggernaut in intellectual thought, right? And not just for black folks, but just thinkers, period, right? When he graduated from Harvard, in his acceptance speech, he told the people of Harvard, I assure you the pleasure was all yours, right? So, although I'm the first black man to go to Harvard, right, I did y'all a favor by coming here, essentially, is the premise that he left them with, right? Another significant thing about Du Bois, he starts off with this notion of the talented tenth. So we're going to educate 10% of the population, and they'll be tasked with educating the other 90% to help lift the people, the African people up. That's how he starts his ideological path, right? A very elitist notion. But when he makes his transition, he's working with Kwame Nkrumah, the president of Ghana, the president of the newly liberated Ghana, and he's working on the Encyclopedia Africana while he's on his deathbed, essentially, right? So he makes his transition as a Pan Africanist, recognizing himself as an African and recognizing African people throughout the diaspora. So this is just a part of the evolution ideologically of W.E.B. Du Bois, right? Um, so we'll start off with the opening page, right? And this is where we get this idea of a question that gets danced around, right? And he says, between me and the other world, there's an ever unasked question. And this is like, to me also, it's beautifully written, and we'll get into it. Unasked by some through feelings of delicacy. So it's a delicate question that they want to ask, but they don't ask it, right? By others through the difficulty of rightly framing the question. Okay? All, nevertheless, flutter around it. They approach me in a half hesitant sort of way, eye me curiously or compassionately, and then, instead of saying directly, how does it feel to be a problem? So that's the question that they want to ask, right? They really want to ask them, how does it feel to be the problem? But they either don't know how to ask the question, they either dance around it delicately, right? But Du Bois knows what's up. He knows what they want to get at, right? And he says, they say, I know an excellent colored man in my town. Or I fought at Mechanicsville. So Mechanicsville is the site of the Civil War. Or do not these Southern outrages make your blood boil, right? So this is the, well, I feel Black Lives Matter too, right? Aren't you just upset about what happened at the Capitol on January 6th, right? So he's bringing up these things to kind of show that I'm an ally, right? But I don't really want to ask the real question that I want to ask, like, what does it feel like to be black in America? You know what? So this is what Du Bois is getting at, right? And he says, at these, I smile, or I'm interested, or reduce the boiling to a simmer as the occasion may require. Excuse me. What do you think that last little stanza means? Or to reduce the boiling to a simmer as the occasion may acquire. What is he telling us there?
I feel like he might be saying to pick and choose your battles depending on your environment. Like, if this is your boss or someone like above you, unfortunately, you can't always like pop off like that. Like you have to just, unfortunately, you just have to take it.
Right. Yep, absolutely. But also, what I read within that too, Megan, he might pop off, right? Like the equation might require for me to just go off on your ass. That's okay too, because the equation dictates that it's okay, right? So there's a little bit of a fire to Du Bois that he often doesn't get credit for, right? So this is how he opens up the essay. So going on page 8, we're introduced to the veil, right? And he's introduced to the veil through exchanging of greeting cards, right? And one of his schoolmates declines the card that he tries to offer to her, right? And that's when he's made aware of his blackness, of his difference, right? And this is when he sees that there's a veil that separates the two worlds. But what's interesting for me is how Du Bois deals with the veil. Go ahead, Marlon. Go ahead.
Just a question I had, and I don't even think it's answered, but was he in a mixed classroom? I mean, I looked up the timeline, and I knew that he was a little bit after the Civil War, though it could be a mixed classroom, but I wouldn't imagine that it would be mixed so quick after the Civil War for at least a few more years. So was he in a mixed class? Was he in a white class? Had he never seen other blacks before? It's just kind of a general kind of general question I have, and I don't think it could be answered. But that's what I came across when I saw that. Like, I could, I guess I could understand a crappy little girl being, crappy white girl being, refusing his
Car.
his card, but was that really his first experience?
Okay. So what I hear you asking, because it's kind of breaking up, was that was the
Was,
classrooms that the boys
mixed,
in?
mixed class.
So you're essentially asking, was it a mixed class that he was in, and how did he have this experience, right, when we're coming so recently out of the Civil War. So a little bit about Du Bois's background. One, he was very fair skinned, very fair skinned. So he really grew up around all white folks, right? Like he was the only black student in his school in Boston, and I believe it wasn't until he went to Fisk University in Tennessee that he really started to be around more black folks, right? So that's one thing about Du Bois, especially early on. He has kind of like an elitist type of perspective. Hence, things like the talented 10th, right? We're going to take the top 10 talented, most well informed individuals and have them teach the rest of the people, right? So, to answer your question, it wasn't like it was a desegregated classroom. No, the boys just had the fortune. I don't even know if I want to call it a fortune. He just had the opportunity to be like the one black kid in these white spaces, right? Because of his intellectual abilities, because of the fairness of his skin. And my memory does not serve me correctly, but there was something that allowed him, either his mother or his father, they knew someone who allowed him to go to school with the white students in Boston, and that's where he was kind of able to get these experiences that most black folks wasn't having at the time. If that answers your question, Marlon. Um, but it's a very good question also. Okay, so we're talking about the veil and how, and so I started to be curious and attentive to how Du Bois he handles this veil, right? Like his response to the veil. So this is on page 8, the middle of the page. Um, he talks about how he realized that he was different. Um, but then he says, then it dawned upon me with a certain suddenness that I was different from the others, or like mayhap, in heart and life and longing, but shut out from their world by a vast veil. So, boom, the veil appears. I had thereafter no desire to tear that veil down, to creep through. I held all beyond it in common contempt, and lived above it in a region of blue sky and great wandering shadows. That sky was bluest when I could beat my mates at examination time, or beat them at a foot race, or even beat their stringy heads. Alas, with the years, all this fine contempt began to fade, for the worlds I longed for and all their dazzling opportunities were theirs, not mine. But they should not keep these prizes. I said some, all, I would wrest from them, right? So to me, there's a lot of things going on there, right? So he realizes that there's things that he doesn't have access to, right, on the other side of the veil. And initially, he doesn't want nothing to do with the veil, right? Like, I'm cool on my side of town doing what I'm doing. That's fine with me. Besides, um, my skies were bluest when I could out intellectually perform you guys on a test, right? If we're racing, I'm about to beat you in this race, and if you really trip, I'm gonna whoop your ass, right? So this is how I'm coping with this veil, right? But then he realizes, like, yo, these opportunities that are taking place that I want, that my side of the veil doesn't offer me, right? But he's not gonna accept that either because I'm gonna wrest these opportunities from them, right? I'm going to steal them. I'm going to snatch them away. I'm going to make these opportunities mine. And if you think about Du Bois's life, right, being the first black man to graduate Harvard, that's exactly what he does, right? He wrests these opportunities from that other world, right? So not only, this is a what I call meta theory, right? So not only is he writing about things that he wants to do from theory, he's actually doing these things in his lived time, right? And then on the next page, we're introduced to this notion and this idea of double consciousness, right? This is on page 9. I'm looking at the first full paragraph towards the middle of that paragraph, and he says, it is a particular sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in an amused contempt and pity, right? So this is how he defines this idea of double consciousness. So how understanding yourself through the gaze of the other, right? So again, how I started off the class last week, and I asked you guys about ontology, right? What does ontology mean? And I said, how you come to understand yourself, how do you come to know who you are, right? Is this idea of ontology. So Du Bois is saying for black folks, for African people, there's a dual ontology at play, right? It's the way that we perceive ourselves, and then it's the way that the others perceive us. And it's a battle at place to kind of determine what ontological understanding of yourself is going to take place, right? Are you going to believe what the others say you are? Or are you going to believe what your ontological understanding of your blackness is, right? And this is the dualness at play. And let me see. And he talks about, right, the two warring ideals, thoughts, and spirits that are inside one dark body, and if it wasn't for the dogged self-assurance, they would be torn asunder, right? So it just kind of shows you there's almost two personalities at play with this double consciousness, right? And then also on page 9, we get the explicit definition of what the thesis of this chapter is. I'm looking at the paragraph, the last paragraph here towards the bottom. The paragraph starts with this then. This then is the end of his striving. And he says he's talking about African people, right? To be a co-worker in the kingdom of culture, to escape both death and isolation, to husband and use her best powers and her latent genius. So this is what the spiritual striving of African people are, according to Du Bois, right? To be a spiritual co-worker, to be a co-worker in the kingdom of culture. So what's a co-worker? What's someone who you would consider a co-worker? Y'all at work, right? Some of y'all. So when you're at work, you have co-workers. Who is that? Is that co-worker your boss? Is that co-worker person who works with you? Thank you, Edgar. But so these individuals who you consider your co-worker, are they typically your superiors? Are they subordinates? Or are they your equals?
They're typically your equals.
Equals, yeah.
Yeah.
Equals.
Hopefully they are.
Yeah. So what Du Bois is saying is, I want to be a co-worker, right? I want to be equal in the kingdom of culture, right? So this is the workspace, this notion of culture, right? I want to be on equal footing with everyone else in this workspace, right? So I want to be able to have my cultural significant attributes, my culturally significant ideals recognized, right? What this class is doing by and large is placing African people as cultural co-workers in the space of history, right? So we're going to talk about our cultural historical phenomenons and place it on equal footing with westernized historical phenomenons, right? So this class in itself is doing what Du Bois seeks to have done for African people, right? To have our culture recognized as co-workers, as equals, okay? So that's the explicit depiction of what this chapter is about, of our spiritual strivings. Um, and then on page 11, he kind of goes through the evolution of how we sought to obtain our liberty, right? So at first it was just notion of freedom, and then the Emancipation Proclamation kicks in, and they get this idea of freedom, right? And then it was like, that's not quite working out the way that we thought it would. We got to adjust. And from there, the 15th Amendment comes in and it gives them the right to vote, right? And they thought that this would be the mechanism that would give them their freedom and their liberty. And they find out that this is not the case also. And then they shift again to book learning, right? To trying to study the cathartic letters. What did you say that the cathartic? What did you say? The Kabbalistic letters of the white man is what he says, right? This is how they try to now attain their freedom. But he also recognizes that that doesn't work, right? So all these attempts, and then there's another attempt that they make later is to work, right? To till the soil to obtain their freedom, right? So from the notion of freedom, from the notion of voting, from the notion of learning, to the notion of working, right? None of those notions afforded them the freedom they were looking for. DuBois is attentive to this, right? And he says we have to bring all of these things together in efforts to obtain our freedom, right? We can't look at these things in isolation. They must be looked at as a whole. And these are the ways that we're going to be able to obtain our freedom. So we have this notion of double consciousness, right? And on page 12, he kind of circles back to this notion of double consciousness in a roundabout way, but he also does something different with this idea of the Negro problem. And it's on the towards the bottom of page 12. It's a sentence starting with in those somber forests. So it says, in those somber forests of his striving, his own soul rose before him, and he saw himself, darkly as through a veil, and yet he saw in himself some faint revelation of his power, of his mission. He began to have a dim feeling that to attain his place in the world, he must be himself and not another. For the first time, he sought to analyze the burden he bore upon his back, that dead weight of social degradation partially masked behind a half-named Negro problem. He felt that his poverty, without a cent, without a home, without land, tools, or savings, he had entered into a competition with rich, landed, skilled neighbors. To be a poor man is hard, but to be a poor race in a land of dollars is the very bottom of hardships, right? And so there's a lot to unpack in that passage. But first and foremost, right, the only way to deal with this double consciousness is to be yourself, right? That's it. That's what he says. To be fully recognized in this world, you have to be yourself. How many of you have heard of the term code switching? Elena, could you kind of explain to the class what code switching is?
I know, like, when I was in high school, people would say to me, oh, like, you code switch, like they would come to my house and be like, I act differently with my family versus with them. Or, oh, I code switch with like the South Asian kids at my school versus the white kids at my school. Or like teachers versus the students. And because I act differently with different people to sort of kind of assimilate into like how they act. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Also, it could be a language thing. Kind of like because someone's Hispanic, you're bilingual, so you would code switch between, speaking Spanglish with your friends or with someone, and then speaking purely Spanish with your family, or you speak a different language with your family. And that's how I think of code switching as well.
Yeah, thank you, Elaine. That's a great point. So to take it to a Black context, right? You're both absolutely right? So from Elena's standpoint, it's the on the corner conversation or the on the corner voice to the at work voice, right? It's the speaking Ebonics at home versus using standard American vernacular English, right? So this is this notion of code switching. This is this dual consciousness playing out, right? So when you have these two warring ideals at play, the other ontology from the other will say, well, we need to put on a proper voice because we're going into a professional setting and I need to sound like I'm professional, right? That's that other ontology at play. While on your natural voice might say, fuck that shit, we're going to talk how we talk, right? And that's just what it's going to be, right? So it's this dual consciousness at play. And when you code switch, it's an enactment of this dual consciousness. So for me, looking at what DuBois says, we must first be ourselves to arrive fully in the world, right? He's talking about not having to code switch, right? He's talking about, although everyone else is speaking English, you continue to speak Spanish, right? Because that's who you are, right? He's talking about when you go into professional settings, like being in front of a classroom, being okay using your Ebonics or African American vernacular English, right? So this is what he's talking about, and this is part of my pedagogy. This is the reason why I don't feel the need to code switch in front of you guys, right? So to have a fully authentic experience, I need to be myself so that you could be comfortable being yourselves, right? So we're not at war with the dual consciousness as we're trying to engage these intellectual ideas, right? So that's definitely on the table in this passage. But then he also talks about this half-named Negro problem, right? And think about how he starts off the essay, right? This question that they dance around, how does it feel to be a problem? But with this passage is very important, very genitive, because it's a shift at play in the way that DuBois is using this Negro problem, right? It's a shift from Black folks being the problem, right, to the problem of Black folks, right? Poverty, right? Not having jobs, not having the resources, not having the tools to compete on the level with the rest of society. So if we are to take this concept of race out of an identity context, right? Where's another way that you hear the word race being used? How else do we use race outside of you thinking about identity? Where else do we race?
We race like running, like kids
Right.
race each other,
Right.
athletes race, and like
Competition.
What'd you say, Marlon? Say it again, man. That's what I was looking for.
So,
Competition. Yep. So, like, let's think about that. Yes, absolutely. Let's think about that. Why would they choose to call your ethnic identity race, right? Implicitly, they're telling you that we're in a competition, right? Like, let's just call it what it is. Races are competing with one another for resources, right? And DuBois is saying, hold on, this Negro problem that you're trying to put on me is not really my fault, right? I've been put in a race without given the tools to be able to race, right? Like, I'm here with no legs racing against y'all with your full faculties, right? So the problem is not me, it's the situation that I've been placed in. And this is the shift that the essay takes place on page 12, right? The problem, even for DuBois, goes from, these are issues because of my epidermis, because of my skin color, to him realizing like, nah, these are issues because of the society around me, right? And it's the shift that takes place on page 12, right? So again, think about this. I'll read it. For the first time, he sought to analyze the burden he bore upon his back, that dead weight of social degradation partially masked behind a half-named Negro problem. He felt his poverty. Without a cent, without a home, without land, tools, or savings, he had entered into competition, right, with rich, landed, skilled neighbors. And that's the Negro problem right there, right? Is you're in a competition without the appropriate tools to be in competition, right? I got two more and we're done. Actually, we'll end with the last one. So on.
Sorry, could I just ask a quick
Yeah,
question?
absolutely.
I don't know how far back this idea goes about like the origins of race and who first identified it, but I feel like DuBois is like he brings up the idea that like race isn't real. It was created. It was like, as they say, like a social construct. And like, was he one of the first people to? Because for me, this is like a new idea I discovered last year, but he's basically identifying that a long time ago.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, Helena, because keep in mind, right, this is published in 1903, okay? Um, Around the late 1800s, right, you really start to see it's not epigenetics, it's another term where they have these social classifications that determines people's intellect by their size of their heads and things of that nature. Thank you, thank you. That's what I'm looking for.
Like the origin of like the whole thing in Nazi Germany. Yeah, it was like this standoff from. Yeah, it was an American idea. The idea of eugenics based on where you were born, your race, and all that sort of stuff, and then like the breeding of healthy superior people with healthy superior people. Yeah, it's eugenics.
Eugenics. Thank you. And so as Danny points out, right, it's an American creation, but it takes up roots in Germany under the Nazi regime. So keep in mind, where is DuBois studying at the end of all of this, right? In Germany, you know what I mean? So he has direct access to a lot of this information, and we can't assume. I think it'll be poor scholarship not to make that connection, right? So I do think that you're onto something, Helena. It's a very, very good call out. I'll end with this. Shoot, it's already 12 o'clock. Okay. And he asked these questions, right? And this is where you get the critique. And this is where, to me, where a lot of the brilliance of the essay comes in. On page 15, the opening paragraph, and he asked, right, will America be poorer if she replaced her brutal, dystopic blundering with light-hearted but determined Negro humility? Or her coarse and cruel wit with loving, jovial good humor? Or her vulgar music with the soul of the sorrow songs, right? So essentially, if I want my culture to be recognized as an equal, as a co-worker, right? He's asking, like, what is America really giving up by replacing this blundering with light-hearted but determined humility, right? One could argue that America may be better off, right? Or her coarse and cruel wit, right, with loving, jovial good humor, right? Like, how would that negatively impact America, right? Or her vulgar music with the soul of the sorrow songs, right? Which you may call the Negro spirituals, right? And if you look at the way that the essay opens up, he's opening up with the Negro spiritual, right? So, although the language can be very put off, it can kind of put you off. It really is it's a brilliantly written essay. When you kind of throw away some of these languages that are confusing and kind of get to the core of his argument, is masterfully written. He uses great counter arguments, right? Like, he takes into consideration the things that he might necessarily not agree with, and he uses it for his arguments. And I think one of those examples we find in his use of the Negro problem, right? So he starts off with this idea of a Negro problem, and he works through it in the way that the majority of people understand it to play out, right? But about halfway of working through this Negro problem, he understands that it's something different, and he shifts that problem to mean what he understands it to mean, right? And as authors, as writers, as intellectuals, these are the type of tools and moods that you could use in your own writing, right? So when I ask you in your journals, okay, yeah, what's his method or what's her method? But I also ask you, how do they produce these arguments? That's what I'm talking about, right? The way that DuBois takes this Negro problem and shifts it and kind of turns it on its head, that's a how. That's a method. That's a methodological move that DuBois has in his writing, right? Something simple as turning the boiling to a simmer, right? It's a beautifully elegant way to articulate that there is a rage there, right? I'm mad as hell, but I'm gonna recognize the circumstances, and I'm gonna just kind of check my emotions, right? So it's a lot that we could pull, even strictly from a writing standpoint, right? Just as if we read this just for the writing alone, right? It's a lot that we could work with. But then when you get into the content of what's being written about, it becomes even more fecund, right? Um, I know I didn't mean to talk this long, so I apologize. But it was a lot, and I want to kind of unpack some of that for you guys. But let's do a fishbowl with the time that we have left, and then we'll call it a day. Does anybody want to volunteer for the fishbowl? Okay, Helena. Elizabeth, I see you clapping. Is that like you trying to volunteer for the fishbowl, or are you just giving me props for the little mini lecture? Anybody else want to? Well, okay. Thank you, Elizabeth. Can we get one more for the fishbowl, and we'll call it a day? Okay, I got you, Megan. Okay. So Helena, Megan, and Elizabeth will be doing our fishbowl for today. I'll shut up, and whoever wants to start, it's on you.
There was just one thing that, I mean, so many things stuck out to me when I was reading this, and I loved reading it. The main thing that was really interesting was the idea of double consciousness, because I feel like, I mean, a lot of the stuff that he talks about goes for, or is applicable to many marginalized groups, or other people kind of in like POC, people of culture. So I was reading, and the quote about double consciousness, which I'm just trying to find quickly, he basically described how this thing that I had saw on Instagram when I was taking a break from reading, and it was a post by this actor from Bridgerton. I don't know if anyone knows, but he was kind of a big deal because he was like the leading man, a Black man in the, and he and obviously I'm very into film and stuff, so it stuck out to me. And he said, the Negro is sort of a seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world, which yields him to no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. And talking about two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body. And then this actor, on the post I saw on Instagram, while I was reading this, like after I had to take breaks because it was a lot to read. I saw Reggie Jean Page. He said, as Black people, we're very used to empathizing with the world through white people's eyes because they're the protagonists. I know what it's like to look at the world and empathize with Superman because I spent my whole life doing that. And he goes on to say that in its own way, he being the main character of this show is the world getting to see what it's like through his eyes. And finally, we're having like, more diversity in film and entertainment. We get to see that. And that's, I just thought that was crazy because like DuBois really touched on that, and how we, in like all of this problem transferred over to the media and the entertainment and everything that we consume in this digital world. And finally now we're getting to see more popular forms of media see see the world through our eyes, if that makes sense. Like I just thought that for any marginalized groups, like it's really important to see to recognize how what we consume, it's really going through, like, for most of the time, for most of our life, it's been through the white lens because they are the majority. Yeah. Sorry, that was really long-winded. Anyone, please feel free to jump in.
I just want to point out two things before we move on that you mentioned, Helena. One, so if we're thinking about our journals, right? What Helena just articulated is what I'm talking about when I say an analysis, right? Like that's a picture perfect depiction of an analysis, right? She read this, she came across some information that is similar to what's being discussed, and she allowed that to help her make sense of what she's engaging. Two, you bring up this idea of the issues transferring to entertainment, right? Two things. One, right, all aspects of society are reflections of that society. So if we're in an anti-black society, anti-blackness was gonna exhibit itself in film, right? It's gonna exhibit itself in technology. So with that being said, for those who are interested in the critique of technology and how we're using technology and those implicit biases that spill off into technology as well, there's a field of study called digital humanities, right? And all the work that they do is investigating things like Twitter and social media and looking for those implicit biases that spill over into those fields as well. There's a lot of really, really great work that's done, especially from like Afrofuturistic thinkers who really question this role of technology as being a political tool, right? And they say like, nah, technology is something that's extremely political and it has great political ramifications for us. So I just want to throw those two things out there because of what you said. I apologize. Next for the fishbowl.
Going off of what Helena said, like that veil and double consciousness really also like resided with me because I feel like, in a lot of the time when you're growing up in like, a mixed family, especially when half of it is white, like in my situation, um, I felt very personal about this whole veil thing because it was so interesting that he had this moment that he realized that I don't know, it sounded like he was a child, so maybe like the thought of, race and everything wasn't there yet, but he knew something was different and that he made the connection like way like later in life that it was, because he was black and he didn't that's where that double consciousness comes from like he didn't view himself like that. But then this girl does this thing and he realizes there's a difference and then later connects it to this whole race thing. And I feel like a lot of, you know, people have that moment and you don't really realize it. Like I didn't personally realize it until way later. I remember like when I was a kid, me and my brother were the only two people of color in our entire family and we spent summers outside and so we get really really dark, we get very tan because we have Filipino genes. um and I remember like my family saying like, oh, you guys don't need sunscreen, like, oh, you guys have to have like some black genes in you or something. And I was just like, I was 8, like I specifically remember that, and it wasn't until years later, like 2 or 3 years ago, that I was like, damn, like I didn't even think of myself as different, but they saw us as different, and that was like fucking family. So I can't even imagine, at a completely different time over 100 years ago, how things would have been, and how I feel like a lot of people have this double consciousness, how you view yourself versus how other people view you. And I like to think that we view ourselves as like the good characteristics, being family oriented, or, being loving and caring, being like a film lover, all these different things. And then you see the news and there's these huge generalizations about all types of people all the time. and you're just like, damn, that's how y'all see us. Like it's just it blows my mind that someone was able to like articulate that feeling into like academia, and that I'm able to like very personally be like, wow, that's crazy. I didn't even know there's a word for that. I didn't even know other people experience that type of thing. Like it's just it's very interesting to think about.
Thank you, Megan. Elizabeth?
So I did take notes while reading the text, so I'm just gonna read through it. Um, After reading the text, I just felt bad because of what Black people experience on a day-to-day basis and still are. So on page 8, he mentions, alas, with the years, all this fine contempt began to fade for the world I longed for, and all their dazzling opportunities were theirs, not mine. This shows the discrimination he begins to experience, or he realizes that he's experiencing for his race, and the white privilege that deprives him from achieving his goals the same way anyone would. It is true that people of color have to try harder to achieve something because of the barriers that are placed in front of them by society. He says just how I would do it. I could never decide by reading law, by healing the sick, by telling wonderful tales that swam in my head some way. So he's already thinking, I have to prove myself, or I have to try in different ways um, to make not a movement, but to make people realize that he's there. Another thing that caught my attention was how he explains his placement in society as two souls, American and Black, stuck in one body. This really stuck out to me because I didn't really think of um that Black people struggle this way. Of course, it's pretty obvious, but personally, I haven't read about double consciousness in this way. But for me, I feel like you wouldn't expect a Black person to consider themselves American because of how much America has taken away from them. I feel like they wouldn't want any part of that. And eventually they would just start to develop hate towards America. But what he is saying is, I'm American too. Like, where are my rights? Like, I live here too. So that's kind of what I got off the text and what really stuck out to me.
This will be my last piece, I promise, because you bring up a really good point, Elizabeth, especially this idea of Black folks identifying with Americanism, right? And we won't read it this class because it's a shortened class, but there's a speech by Malcolm X that I typically have my classes go over, the ballot or the bullet, and he speaks to this idea very explicitly. Um, and I kind of agree with you, Elizabeth. Like I'm on the stance of I don't consider myself an American. Like, even if you hear me talk, I never you and I will never use the term African American. At best, it'll be Africans in America, right? And that's in lieu of what Elizabeth just talks about. Like out of all that we've been through, I don't feel the need to try to attach myself to that. Furthermore, out of all the things that America's done to be America, I don't want to attach myself to that, right? Again, to kind of go back to Malcolm, he uses the example of if everyone's at a table eating, right? And then I pull up a chair and I'm sitting at the table, but I don't have a plate, right? I'm not eating, right? So for Black folks, you could be on American soil, but for us to have to vote, we had to organize, fight, and die, right? For us to be able to go to school where we wanted to be able to school, we had to organize, fight, and die, right? For us to live in certain areas, we had to organize, fight, and die. So if that's been our experience historically, and it continues to this day, how American are we, right? We're not eating like everybody else at this table is eating, right? And then another thing that Elizabeth said, she says, you know, why would you want to? But let's be real, there's some people who, Black folks, who do want to be American, right? The Candace Owens of the world, right? Historically, the Jackie Robinsons of the world, Herschel Walker right now, right? These are these Black folks who attach themselves to these American ideals, who's in the space of double consciousness. They believe what the other is saying, right? And there's also this notion of Stockholm syndrome. Has anybody heard of the term Stockholm syndrome? Megan, could you kind of articulate what Stockholm syndrome is for those who have not?
In this context, I feel like it would be like identifying with the oppressor. It's like you've been oppressed for so long, it's like you're buying into the ideas that they're throwing out there. But in like a medical sense, it's basically like when you get kidnapped and then you want to stay there with, like, you develop, a way to cope emotionally with these traumas, therefore to like save your mental space and mentality and stuff, you want to be with that person, you want to stay in this position of where you are.
And so if we are to think about the African experience, right? Were we not kidnapped, right? Were we not brought to a foreign land, right? Abused, right? And now some of us will say things like, go to Africa. Why would I go to Africa? I'm glad there was slavery because that way I'm no longer in Africa living in the jungles, right? These are the things that you would hear black people say, right? So when you talk about Stockholm syndrome, that's to me that's where these things play out, right? That's where, as Elizabeth said earlier, when she's talking about double consciousness, these two warring ideals, right? The whiteness in that war won, and now you identify and you capitulate to these things, right? So we'll end it here. Phenomenal conversation, you guys. I want to show you next week's. You had a question, Megan? Oh, okay. I just want to show you guys next week's reading, and then we'll call it a day. Yeah, yeah. I'm looking at the chat. Yeah, absolutely, Megan. You're right. So this is what we're at for next week. Excuse me. So we got a letter to my nephew, James Baldwin. Really, really dope reading. And actually, they partner together very well because Baldwin is dealing with this idea of double consciousness as well, but it's more in an abstract way. He won't call it double consciousness, but it's the same premise. And this is a letter that he wrote to his nephew, I believe, on his 15th birthday. So yeah, we'll engage that. I'll also add a short, like 7-minute video to this. It's additional footing. It's actually I had a visual methods class last fall for my PhD program, and I had to do what's called a digital storytelling. So it's a video of me telling the story how I was introduced to the reading that we're gonna engage for the week. So I'll post that up right now, and that way you guys can look at that for our conversation on Thursday. And then we'll just do what we did today on Thursday. Any other questions from me, you guys? Okay, so what I will try to do Thursday is we're going to talk about an abstract as you guys start to think about your paper proposals. Okay, so we'll spend some time talking about that. And I think this is a good week to do so, not only because we only have 1 week after this, but if you're talking about writers, right? James Baldwin and W.E.B. Du Bois, those are two great places to kind of situate ourselves when we're thinking about writing. All right, y'all. Appreciate you. Be well, be healthy, be safe, get some water, exercise, and sun. I will see you on Thursday. Peace.